Specializing in evals, we're taking on a new approach going towards simulation. We have something cooking there, but yeah, LLM Ops specializes in evals and slowly kind of going even deeper into evals. Yeah. We kind of started from the tool to find a problem, which was kind of a reverse way of going about it. But we had a general faith in the technology itself that, oh, there's something useful here. Our product is the most like scalable and flexible of any of the products I've seen in this space, just because we've had a really long time to build compared to our competitors. It's not software, guys. It's not fixed logical execution rules, like quite far from that. I think we definitely did cross a very meaningful inflection point in our space where the best open source models are finally competitive with the closed source. The question of did this thing do the job does come down to the vibe check. Still comes down to the vibe check because I just generally think all the benchmarks that are out there right now are like meaningless. The literature on like how to fine tune OpenAI models better or Anthropic models better is like extremely lacking. It's about the vibe, like what kind of a experience are you trying to create in your club? So you do a vibe check on the person. You say, hey, this person has the right clothing, they have the right swagger, right? If we understood to whatever mathematical extent we can what this model is doing inside its matrix with all its vector multiplication and so forth, create some kind of a mathematical model of what's happening inside. If we have to rely so much on people for ensuring alignment of our systems, we're not going to get very far because it's too costly, it's too slow, etc., etc. We want to be iterating as close to the speed of thought as possible on our systems and just making changes really rapidly. Even with an 8 billion parameter model, which is paired with a regressor, you can outcompete a model like GPT-4 on evaluation just because it's been custom built. The best analogy to think about applications in generative AI is to think in terms of levels of self-driving automation. That's how I think of it, right? You start from level one, human in the loop. AI is basically an assistant. It relies, and then level two, three, four, five is you don't even need to tell your AI what to do. Can it go teach itself how to fix that spaceship, completely new domain, read some books, figure it out, and then go fix the spaceship, which no one's done before. Everyone else is trying to build a reliable application on top. It's just the bar is so high. Early to market, take over as much of the pie as possible, and then cement your reputation and gain trust. Right? That's the game you have to play if you're a rapper company. The most surprising thing was role-based prompting doesn't work anymore. Because what matters in the prompt is actually how many tokens does the model think for, not as much as A, just having it think through before giving the solution matters, but B, how many tokens it takes to think actually increases your performance. And it's incredible that it works. Like it worked for Llama, it worked for Grok recently released like a tool calling model, which was purely synthetically trained. And it beats Sonnet 3.5 on tool calling. Please try to find a deterministic, fast, cheap evaluator which gets you a good signal as soon as possible. Don't fuck around with LLM as a judge for too long. We really need to innovate in this space, maybe using hot generated inputs for a particular domain task and then seeing how it performs on average over many repetitions instead of relying on its one time. Safety and bias and unfairness, that's a very hard problem. It's just the definitions. As you said, the metrics are very murky. Um, there's a lot of different ways to spin it.
Hey everyone. So today we have a very exciting talk with the co-founder of Honeyhive. They are one of the premier LLM ops startups in the space. They got after it fairly early, and Dhruv, the CTO, takes us through his journey co-founding Honeyhive right at the release of ChatGPT, pretty much. The trials and tribulations he's had with other companies that were LLM related as well, and just early stuff career wise and what motivated him to get into the space. Obviously, LLM evals is a very hot topic today, and he's had a number of talks just this past year, him and his co-founder. and he really touches on the importance of evaluation from a safety to mankind perspective, how it's quite a departure from classic ML evaluation and certainly traditional software engineering techniques like unit testing, and like the introduction of something called vibe checked, and these vibe checks are a it's something that we've never experienced before because they're much more softer and on the human heuristic level than anything we've used before in software engineering or classic ML. We also talk about model distillation, different scoring metrics like the Bradley Terry model, ELO score, etc. And obviously, this conversation comes hot off the heels of Llama's new release, and we definitely talked about how what this actually means for the future. This is obviously a huge turning point for the open source community, and we're very, very curious to see how things pan out. We talk about application layer companies, of course, the famous probability doom question as well. I really hope you enjoy this talk. So, hey, Dhruv, thanks for joining us. I appreciate it.
No, of course, anytime.
Yeah, so,
Really enjoy talking with you as well.
yeah, likewise. It was certainly your the material and the presentations that you had thus far are quite impressive. I understand that you had a couple more after we met at Data Council.
Yeah, and the AI quality conference, those two. Yeah.
Okay, so you guys have
The
been.
other one, the other talk isn't up yet, so I think that's why you probably haven't seen it. Yeah.
I see. Yeah, you guys have been getting a good amount of stage presence, which is awesome. Yeah, obviously, you guys are also a hot topic out there in today's space, right? Would you couch yourself as LLM ops with a specialization in evals?
Yeah, yeah. I think right now I think, yeah, specializing in evals, we're taking on a new approach going towards simulation. We aren't super public about that yet. We have something cooking there, but yeah, LLM ops specializes in evals and slowly kind of going even deeper into evals. Yeah,
I see. I see.
yeah,
It's a very hot topic. It would be helpful to kind of understand, just for the audience sake, what is Honeyhive? How did you guys stumble into the idea in the first place? You guys have already told
yeah,
me, which
yeah.
was very interesting. I know that you had saw a startup or experimented with a startup prior, which was kind of in the SQL to query space, or text to SQL rather. And I forgot what you had done before that, but yeah, if you can give the audience kind of a lowdown about your background and how you guys stumbled into Honeyhive.
Yeah, for sure. So I can start off with my own personal background, how I met Mohawk, and then how we got started with the company. For myself, Mohawk and I, first of all, we came to America to study at Columbia University doing our undergraduate degree. I studied computer science. Mohawk studied operations research, mostly on quant engineering, things like that. We were roommates in college, and I was always kind of interested in what was happening with ML back then. This was like 2018 to 2020, like the big data ML hype was really taking off then. And so I had a roommate, Colin Burns, he was the creator of the MMLU, and he was a part of the super alignment team. And yeah, like I was always around this kind of AI discourse and people conjecturing about AGI or whatnot back in 2018. So that kind of got my interest in this space. I was still like kind of bouncing around back then, working on genetic engineering and software engineering, blah, 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 all those kinds of things. But kind of seeing like the potential with AI, I was like, there might be something here. So I got a job at Microsoft after college, doing the most boring thing imaginable, working on logging systems for email.
Okay.
yeah, like logging, like all the messages and emails going through Microsoft's data centers. Like my sub team was kind of in charge of maintaining the traces of the payloads as they were going through the environments, et cetera, et cetera. And I learned a lot from that experience just around observability, logging, and how those things work. But I pretty much quickly got on the OpenAI and GPT train. Basically, end of 2021, I saw that Microsoft invested in OpenAI, and I actually did get access to GPT-3 the day it came out. And I was like, I had a very long discussion about the philosophy of science with this model, and it schooled me. And I was a little surprised. I was like, "Oh, this is AI." Like I thought AI was like, bounding boxes on pictures and fill in the blank sentences, that kind of thing. So
I see.
that was quite the perspective shift.
Yeah, yeah. This is the post Instruct GPT when they slapped on the ARIMA model to it, and it was doing next token prediction, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah.
it sounds like your experience at Microsoft with logs was that. Now, were you building a parser of some sort, and you were doing just software engineering?
Uh, yeah, like it was software engineering plus big data analytics. So it was like, A was obviously the log parser, so we were responsible for that, like making sure it's efficient, PII, blah blah blah, just make sure it's good, and then taking all the logs from all their data centers. Like this is the number which I used to always be wowed by, which is Microsoft generated like petabytes of
That's right.
logs in a
Yeah.
day from one service that we were responsible for. And so just the kind of mechanics around how to analyze that data, so on and so forth. I got the hang of it pretty quick, and then I was bored. I was like, okay,
Yeah.
there's a very clear
Well,
stack
I
over
mean,
here. So then I got into it.
clearly, it probably gave you the engineering chops to to basically handle machine learning models at scale, which is kind of what Honeyhive does today.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. So I can jump
yeah,
into that really quick, which is just so I got involved with Microsoft's OpenAI innovation team, did some projects with the OpenAI team, open source like a shell copilot, and then I basically became very interested in starting a company in generative AI. It wasn't called Gen AI then; it was called NLG, Natural Language Generation. And yeah, like I was like, gotta do an NLG startup. And then my co-founder at the time, he was also interested in starting a company, Mohawk. And so then we got together kind of midway through 2022, and we decided, hey, let's figure out how can we use Gen AI to whatever create value for the ecosystem. We kind of started from the tool to find a problem, which was kind of a reverse way of going about it. But we had a general faith in the technology itself that, oh, there's something useful here. So we started from text to SQL. We found that the models at the time weren't reliable enough to give you a lot of value. So then we pivoted into Sales Copilot, Product Manager Copilot, CSM Copilot. It's kind of going through every single function in a company and trying to design a copilot for each one. We did get some traction around the PM Copilot, and got a few design partners for that. And we ended up having to build a lot of tooling for ourselves in order to like created my own version of LangChain because LangChain wasn't a thing then, and created my own version of Honeyhive because the current product it wasn't a thing then. Kind of had to create our own stack from scratch, and in that experience, kind of realized that the tooling that is required to build these kinds of applications is extremely bespoke. It's very unique to generative AI, and so we realized, oh, there might be a huge potential to this, and so then we started like what I like to think is the first LLM ops company, end of 2022, before ChatGPT and all these things became a thing. And yeah, it was just us and Human Loop around then. And yeah, we got started with that and raised it around and kept going from there.
yeah,
Um, yeah, that's the
that's right. I
rough journey.
remember seeing your guys' Honeyhive like way early on in the days when you know that Lumascape thing that has all the AI companies on it.
Yeah,
But
yeah,
certainly, LLM ops is quite a saturated space now. So, specifically, I don't want to take the words out of your guys' mouths, but how would you distinguish yourselves?
Yeah, so I think the true answer with Honeyhive is that our product is the most like scalable and flexible of any of the products I've seen in this space. Just because we've had a really long time to build compared to our competitors, like our systems are like extremely flexible in the level of granularity and analysis you can do with your logs. Now, of course, most people they do very simple level of spreadsheet based thumbs up, thumbs down, so on and so forth. For those kinds of use cases, like we are kind of release open source tooling to kind of empower them as well. So yeah, like we really make sure that the entire life cycle is managed pretty well, and our flexibility and scalability shows throughout in that kind of product journey. But yeah, that's kind of it on a high
I
level,
see.
like how I would
What?
be.
How would
Yeah.
you? There's this constant battle with open source and closed in our space, right? So I definitely want to jump
Yeah.
into that with some of the bigger names out there. But before we go to that, now have you? How would you relate Honeyhive to ChainForge and Eval Gen?
Right. So that tooling is kind of specifically focused on doing like bespoke evaluation for certain types of prompt systems and even like multi-prompt systems. So they're kind of fully all in on the eval problem. We kind of realized that observability and eval are an interconnected challenge. Like it's not like with GenAI evaluation, the biggest issue is you don't know what is the requirements that your system is supposed to be able to solve, right? Like with software, it's very easy to say like, all right, these are the kind of user flows I want. These are the kinds of inputs my API is supposed to be able to handle. This is the kind of response I expect. It's not that simple with GenAI. Like it's if my user has this kind of an intention, we should be able, and it doesn't matter how they say it, what format they say it in. They say it in German, English, with broken English, etc., etc. Like the requirements are very open ended in terms of what your system is expected to be able to handle. And to know exactly where to test it and what paths to validate in your application, you do need to have a very tight loop with what's actually how it's actually being used, because that'll help you kind of constrain and nail down, okay, this is the way in which my users are asking me these questions. I need to make sure when people ask me the question this way, my app works. Or these are the kind of topics that people are interested in, these are the kinds of actions they want to get done. Okay, let's set up tests for those and make sure that those work properly. So I think evalgen tooling like that kind of make like a early assumption, which is, hey, you're anyways not able to get your application working on the few examples that you do have in house. Just take that data set, load it into this thing. We'll come up with good evaluators. And evalgen as a paper, I do believe in the idea. I think it's sound. But yeah, like it's still not like as active and real an evaluation experience as I think is necessary for you to get a Gen AI application actually working. And but the thing is, I like to call this the cultural baggage of DevOps and MLOps,
Yeah.
which is that kind of mindset and that way of thinking about testing is something's going to take a long time for us to kind of weed out of our thinking. But yeah, like an AGI or general intelligence based system and building like applications around those is going to require like us to fundamentally rethink how we think about testing and these kind of things, as you must have seen in my talk.
That's right.
So yeah, that's it. I think that's like the part of the product philosophy with Honeyhive too, is why we leave things extremely flexible and easy to analyze. It's just because I think it's more of an exploratory kind of discovery testing in GenAI. It's less of like, I know exactly what I want and I want it to work for that, which is how we think of it in software. And to a
Yeah, I mean
certain
they
extent,
borrowed
even.
some
Yeah.
concepts from software, which is why they call it assertions, right?
Right. Exactly.
Wait,
Exactly.
it's
Yeah.
I thought it put some relatable or some framework that is relatable for every dev or anyone that has like somewhat of a technical background that's akin to familiar to unit testing, right? Snippets of code.
Yeah. Exactly.
But to your point,
Exactly.
Yeah, to your point, it's eh, this is like a different beast that we're looking at, right?
Yes, yes, it's not software, guys. It's not fixed logical execution rules. Like quite far from that. There's some like really interesting research around like how can you convert a large transformer into a software program. Companies like Martian are working on that, and I've seen a few labs work on it. I do find that's a very interesting direction for the average software engineer who doesn't really understand how a transformer works. Yeah, it's I guess I get it. Like people just think of it as a black box API, and let's just treat it like an API, like it's a piece of software. Like I think that's it's relatable. It makes sense. It's just you're not going to have a reliable application that way. That's my opinion, but that's how I feel
Makes
about it.
sense. Yeah. Ergo, what we might see in today's distinction with closed source and open source models. Speaking of which, obviously we are coming. This call is coming hot off the heels of Llama's latest release of 3.1, and I'm sure you've seen the benchmarks, and it's interesting. It seems to beat out, or it's at least on par with the best models, which I think Claude Sonnet had the best model to date, and it seems to be on par with it. Yeah, I'd love to kind of get your thoughts, especially what marked this call in general was evaluations and how basically uh, how do we benchmark these things, right? These LLMs, right? It's look, we'll talk about this later, but there's going to certainly be a future where people are going to continue to prompt LLMs. They will continue to rag them, fine tune them, distill them, and study them and evaluate them, right? Hence, do we have infrastructure in place? But yeah,
Yeah,
going back to Llama and its latest release, what are your thoughts there?
yeah. I think let me take it two part. First, I'll talk about the Llama thing, then about the evaluation stuff. But so I think from Llama, so I think we definitely did cross a very meaningful inflection point in our space where the best open source models are finally competitive with the closed source
Huge
models.
milestone.
And yeah, it's a huge milestone for us since we started. And I think there's a lot to dissect there. First of all, what happened to that leak of that closed source lab? What are they doing in those labs out there? Did they run out of data? Is the GPU not working? They had a pretty good lead, in my opinion,
They
last
had a
year.
pretty good lead,
So that,
and they
yeah,
obviously make more money, right? I don't know how, but the interesting thing is that I don't know what's in it for Facebook, but it's
yes, yes. I mean, I love Zuck. I mean, his philosophy is very interesting here, right? He thinks of it as new platform for compute, and I think his podcast with Barkish was interesting, where he said Meta designed like this data center networking infra back in the day, and then they open sourced it. And then once they open sourced it, all the contractors and suppliers in the data center kind of space adopted their convention just because they open sourced like a really good design for a data center. And so then people started to build a bunch of tooling that was specific to their convention. And so they ended up creating like their own supply chain simply by just open sourcing like a really good convention. And so he's kind of thinking of it the same way with Llama, which is, hey, I open source this model, I make it fully permissive. I think we really need to talk about that. Like he's given people full free reign on the model. Like you can generate tokens out of this thing and train on it. If he won't sue you, like you can do, I mean, whatever you want with that model, right? And so by creating this kind of permissiveness around the model, he is basically banking on creating an ecosystem of tooling around it, similar to the data center thing. And I don't know. I think he's on to something with that. Like we have to talk about local llama, right?
that's
As the
right.
subreddit is. it's okay. Actually, this now connects to your benchmarking question that we were talking about earlier, which is people are gonna create LLM applications in all different kinds of ways, like fine tuning, distillation, etc. The question of did this thing do the job does come down to the vibe check. Still comes down to the vibe check because I just generally think all the benchmarks that are out there right now are like meaningless. They're like really hard to trust just because of poisoning and things like that. Like there's some innovation that can be done there, stuff that Scale AI has done, and so on. But I think it's just like the problem is fundamentally so multifaceted of like how do you get a sense of how good a model is that you really just have to use it yourself as much as possible in an intelligent way. So anyway, so going back to local llama is this community of people who are just like trying to get this llama model running on their local device
On
wherever
device.
and just
That's
on
right.
device, right? Like the GPU, if they'll buy GPU racks, turn their
Right.
house into a data center, man. Like these guys don't care, right? Like they want intelligence right here, right now, in front of
Local
me.
Llama is the community name
And yeah,
of these.
yeah, it's a community name. Yeah, on Reddit, and like I've been following them since 2022, 2021. Um, just because back then there wasn't a lot of people talking about open source models when I first got into this space, and so yeah, what you find is that people have come up with a lot of different ways to quantize the model, extremely specific fine tuning pipelines which work really well for those models, so on and so forth. Whereas the literature on like how to fine tune OpenAI models better or Anthropic models better is like extremely lacking. Just because they don't give you enough control over the model, so you really can't do LoRa.
That's
And
right.
my God, there's so many different techniques. The more I'm thinking about it, but like all these techniques you can do on a Llama model, but you can't do on a closed source model. And right now, the whole moat that these closed source model providers had, in my mind, was like, even if I had the data to fine tune an open source model, and I put in the work and the effort, the best performance that I could get out of that model would still be worse than the performance that I would get out of just using an API from one of these closed source labs, right? That's the whole reason I think it, like the closed source move made sense to me is like, okay, yeah, there's a big gap. So even with all that tooling and this whole ecosystem, that open source ecosystem just can't hit the bar. But now that's not the case. I think over the coming weeks, it will be interesting to see how much success people achieve with fine tuning these new llama models and whether or not that performance gap of even the fine tuned version like starts to surpass like the closed source model enough that it makes sense for everyone en masse to move away from closed source to open source. Now of course, closed source labs, they raise a lot of VC
Right.
capital. They need to generate revenue. So they OpenAI is playing all these tactics, making GPT-4o Mini extremely cheap. So even if you self-hosted a Llama model, they like the tokenomics don't work out, so you still use their model. They made fine tuning free. They made fine tuning free. That's how desperate they are right now to
That's
make sure.
interesting. That that's super interesting.
Yeah, so that's just like what's happening on the macro with this open source closer. It's a very interesting time we're in. Yeah, and I'm like I don't want to take sides here. Like with most hype trends, I don't like doing that. But man, there's a lot of tooling that the local Llama people have built out and the academic community. So it, OpenAI and Anthropic are going to get a run for their money with the Llama model. So we'll see. We'll see.
Yeah, there's no doubt about people have been waiting for this day for quite some time. I didn't think myself that it would come so soon. But to your point, yeah, I mean, there's so many
Yes.
different distillation like techniques, right? Quantization, LoRa,
So many.
etc.
So
Right?
many.
To the point where
Yeah.
it's just like you guys kind of introduced a concept of tiny judges, right? Like these specialized
Yeah.
models
Yeah.
for these specific tasks, right? It could be very interesting, and not just that. There's an entire economy of on-device, uh, uh, uh,
Right.
yeah, on-device usage,
Exactly.
which you know uh, the closed source guys can't play around with yet because you rely on their API calls, right?
Yeah, and I think the on-device game I still think is a little too early. Like it was interesting. I wonder what you think of the human pin and the rabbit model. I think most of those guys were using APIs, but I think give it another 2 years. I think wearable AI will become more realistic. Then I think the multimodality stuff really needs to be more robust and reliable before, at least for consumer wearable devices like model on your body kind of thing. Yeah, only then that would work. But I think the next generation of laptops, I'm sure, will all come with powerful and GPUs. Be interesting to see what happens there. I think, oh yeah, like Apple in their recent announcement, I think they did a really brilliant job with their Gen AI strategy. And like they released that model which runs locally on the newer iPhones, which is really good at doing like iPhone tool calling, like actions. That's brilliant. I think those kinds of on-device models make a lot of
Yeah,
sense. Um,
I think, what do you call that? Back in the day, it's basically a co-pilot, right? For that's on device, right? And
exactly.
it doesn't need internet activity to, or yeah, or online capabilities to call out to some kind of
Yeah.
on the cloud closed source model. It's on device, right? It's just running on its own GPU.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's brilliant, no brainer.
Yeah.
I foresee like everything, like even cars having stuff like that, right? And
Yeah.
it's not, it shouldn't be
Yeah.
expected that a car is, has Wi-Fi capabilities all the time, right? And Tesla
Yeah.
has been
Yeah.
leaning pretty hard on coming out with humanoid robots. I'm fairly certain that it's going to be on device as well, right? We were just talking
Yeah.
about lawyers and our struggles with them, right? But typically, they don't want their information leaving their ecosystem either, right? So
Yeah.
there's
Yeah.
certainly like a fairly large economy for them. So look, you also mentioned something interesting earlier, and I just that I know we know what vibe checks are, and I think it's an
Oh, right.
invention of the current era that we're in. This is again a distinction from classical ML to generative AI.
Yeah.
So could you explain what are vibe checks? How
Yeah.
did the word come about, and so forth?
Yeah. So the vibe check, as the name suggests, is imagine there's a bouncer outside a club, right? What's their responsibility? A is obviously right. They gotta make sure whoever's coming in has the right ID, they have the right age, etc., etc. But that's not it, right? It's about the vibe. Like, what kind of a experience are you trying to create in your club? So you do a vibe check on the person. You say, hey, this person has the right clothing, they have the right swagger, so on and so forth. They're like vibe check pass. You can come into the club, right? That's where the term kind of originally comes from. And when it's applied in generative AI, it's imagine you have different models, right? You have GPT-4, you have Claude 3, right? Imagine these are people, and they're trying to get into whatever application you're trying to build, right? Oh, I want to be the base for your application, or I want to be the base. What you kind of have to do is check them out, ask them a few questions, see if they understand the style in which you want your answers, understand the level of depth that you want, etc., etc. A lot of these things aren't super quantifiable, and so that's like the vibe part of it. That there's this qualitative, like this qualia to it, where you kind of just through your interactions with the model generate, like, have an intuition for whether or not you would trust it to do a good job for you in whatever application you're building. And so yeah, you basically give it a vibe check. It's like, yeah, this is good enough. Kind of making it more practical. Let's say I'm building a content writer, like a blog post. Like right now, people just go to ChatGPT, give it some context, have it generate some output. But then Sonnet 3.5 came out, and then everyone's like, "Hey guys, Sonnet is great at writing content." And then everyone goes on Sonnet, asks the same thing, and then sees the response there. And then it's based on just this kind of vibey kind of checking that people decide which model to use and which not to use, or which prompt to use, not to use, etc. This is the primary method right now of evaluation in the
Mm.
ecosystem. And and how people decide which model to use, which retriever to use, etc., etc. And the reason we have to rely on this kind of a system is because, um, as in classical ML, we had Blue, we had Roach, we had the loss function, F1, perplex, so on and so
They're
forth.
very rigorous
These like
mathematical functions. Yeah.
yes, exactly. Like and the reason we had mathematical metrics is because we mathematically understood what the model is doing. That's how I think of it. We had a mathematical model of the system, right? Neural nets first came out. We're like, okay, mathematically speaking, it should do well on this function if it's doing a good job. We don't have that with LLMs.
Right.
Like
It's
it's
like
just
this fuzzy
like we have
heuristic, right? That's
yeah
very
yeah.
soft and human interpretable, I guess.
Yeah, and it's just a symptom of our lack of understanding of what the system's doing, right? If we understood to whatever mathematical extent we can what this model is doing inside its matrix with all its vector multiplication and so forth, create some kind of a mathematical model of what's happening inside, then we could create a metric based on that model, which is if the system's doing a good job, then this mathematical model that I have of the system would give a green signal or a red signal, etc. So we would have some mathematical way of measuring what's happening, and then a mathematical metric, and then that would be your evaluation. But fundamentally, that thing maybe it fundamentally can't exist. That's possible because things are just so subjective, such as content writing, that maybe there is no mathematical way to
Yeah, it's not
quantify
like you just look
law.
at the residuals, right? And you measure you
Right,
can minimize the
right.
length of the residuals on a cost function or something like that. And that's how you arrive to the best fitted line or the best
Yeah,
model for whatever you're working on.
but yeah, like I think so. This is the most interesting research that I think is being done today in generative AI is like preference models, right? Like this is still not going to stop the model provider labs from continuing to iterate and spending God knows how much money on GPU training jobs, right? They still need some kind of quantifiable signal to back propagate through their neural net. And the way that, that's where a lot of innovation happens nowadays, like the Bradley Terry model, the KTO model, the DPO model, etc. All these different ways of tuning the model, in my mind, are just different ways of mathematically capturing human preference. Like the original RLHF paper was like, okay, even if people can't mathematically quantify how
Yeah,
good something is to them, they can still tell me what is better or
thumbs up, thumbs
worse.
down, right?
No, not thumbs up, thumbs down. It's more like compared to this blog, is this blog better or
Oh,
worse?
the ranking in RLHF, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So that was the first breakthrough, right? It was like, oh, even if we can't get a score, we can get relative scores. And then using those relative scores, we can train a judge model, like a preference model, which can then judge what my model is doing. And then I can back propagate that through my network to make it better. But then RLHF kind of capped out, and then DPO came around, and then DPO still is king, from what I can tell, as a way of capturing human preference. DPO fundamentally didn't innovate on the preference model that RLHF came up with, just came up with a easier way of mathematically expressing that. And so it's easier to optimize. But KDO, IRPO, these are some of the new techniques around. Like I think what's the cool thing now for preference modeling is like using synthetic generation and generating a lot of different responses from the same model, and then having that model go and judge all its different solutions and then have it re-rank its own answers and then use that to optimize the model. So yeah, I think this is the fundamental issue with Gen AI, and I think this is where most of the breakthroughs need to come for each step function improvement in model performance. And my hope is someone at OpenAI or Google comes up with a mathematical
Explain.
breakthrough. Yeah, for what the hell is going on? Because until we have that, doing like a reliable evaluation of these systems is like just really hard. It's very manual, and there are ways to get around the manualness, but it's just like the baseline performance of these applications is so low that you really do want to rely as much as possible on manual annotation and contractors to make sure the quality remains up there. So yeah, kind of I think that's like the hard point that our space is stuck in and has been stuck in for more than a year now. It's just us not being able to get over this hump. And
Right.
yeah,
I mean, so
I
Ergo,
don't.
like at this current juncture, right? As you put it, right, quite well, that we still need humans to ensure alignment, basically, right? And
Yes.
the there are techniques, right, that can kind of bypass that, or not maybe bypass that, but at least try to shortcut that, improve that self reflection, right? Where you just basically have the
Yeah.
model check its own work, but then it's subject to its own biases, right? So, yeah, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, we can get into that because that is the status quo. You're right. Using LLM as a judge still. We should have moved on 3 months ago, but I think the ecosystem hasn't caught on to what's happening with the reward model stuff.
The what
So,
model?
like the reward
Oh,
model leaderboard, I follow that leaderboard religiously, man. Like it's
can you tell the
brilliant.
audience a bit about what it is?
Yeah. So as we just discussed, if we have to rely so much on people for ensuring alignment of our systems, we're not going to get very far because it's too costly, it's too slow, etc., etc. We want to be iterating as close to the speed of thought as possible on our systems and just making changes really rapidly, getting a quick signal moving. So obviously, like relying on a manual evaluation framework won't get you that. So then basically the buck moved, and then this NLG eval paper came out, which showed, hey, using GPD kind of correlates well with human feedback. Like there is some hope with using LLM as a judge. But then a recent paper came out with Judge Bench, which showed that that paper's findings were flawed, and that even if you just change the outputs that the LLM is judging even slightly, it will just go haywire and crazy, which is again a symptom of our lack of understanding of the model. But yeah, LLM as a judge, just as an approach, seems to have a lot of drawbacks to it. Mainly the thing being its biases, like it prefers really long responses, it prefers responses generated by itself, it prefers terms that are more familiar to it, that are in its training data set, so on and so forth. So it's not like a very objective judge. So like it's a biased judge, but it's at least faster than people. And so that's I think why people
Mm.
rely on it today, and it's the go-to method of evaluation. But it's not the best method of evaluation. It's a very naive approach in my opinion. And so the reward model leaderboard kind of created by I think the Allen Institute, it's such a brilliant effort, which is, hey, this is a leaderboard. This is a leaderboard problem. We need to figure out some kind of model out there which can do a really good job of giving objective, unbiased assessments of subjective outputs. And so they created a leaderboard for it, and they call it the reward model leaderboard. And yeah, like the top performing model there is not an LLM. I mean, it's like a fine tune of a llama, which I mean, it's not fully a transformer. I guess that's what I should say. It's not a pure transformer architecture, which is the right architecture for scoring things. Like the, I guess that's one thing I want to get across to the community is transformers are generative models. They're not classification or regression models. They're generative. They generate. They hallucinate. It's a feature. Let them do it. They just like it's just how they work. They just keep generating more and more tokens, and then that's how they kind of ideate and create. But the reverse task of, oh, I have a bunch of garbage text or a really big unstructured blob of string and images, whatever it may be. How do I classify this thing into different scores? That's a different problem. A transformer wasn't designed for that. It might turn out to feel like it's doing well on that, but it's not designed for that. And the best model on the reward bench leaderboard is this model called RMO RM.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I read
Maybe
that
it's
in one of your your presentations. Yeah,
yeah, like these guys just did a very simple thing. They just took the transformer and then put a linear regressor on top.
the header.
And yeah, like the final layer is just a regressor, and then they back propagate it through that neural net, which like a transformer with a regressor on top. And then turns out, even with an 8 billion parameter model, which is paired with a regressor, you can outcompete a model like GPT-4 on evaluation, just because it's been custom built. You know what I mean? For doing this kind of classifications, coding kind of task. So yeah, like I think that those kinds of approaches still make a lot more sense to me. I think it's still a band-aid solution. I think the proper solution might come from interpretability or from converting LLMs to code, those kinds of approaches, because they're more rigorous and strict. But this kind of approach of use an LLM to judge an LLM is like very flaky. It's a good signal. I think it's a good enrichment mechanism,
Enrichment's a
but
good
it's
word for
not
it.
a yeah. Like it gives you some idea of what's going on, but it's not a evaluation like standard. And it's horrible, man. Llama Index, LangChain, all these popular tools, the way when you ask them, hey, can you evaluate my RAG or my agent, they use an LLM. It's just I think about that a lot. This is,
Right.
and those are the tools that everyone in the ecosystem is
Right. So
using.
that kind of
They
brings
think,
about a bigger question, right? So if we're using LLMs to police LLMs, right? We're using AI to police AIs, right? And I didn't want to bring this topic up, but like it's an interesting topic. It's kind of cheesy at this point. Like, what think about probability doom, right?
what do you mean?
You've heard of probability doom. It's what
No,
it's the catchphrase that a lot of thought leaders are using regarding the AI takeover, right? And malicious intent on mankind,
I
right?
see.
And
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
of course,
Right,
we're
right.
thinking like way out there, right? This is like conspiracy stuff as
No,
well.
no, it's definitely worth thinking about.
That's right. I mean, and
Yeah,
that's why they call it probability doom
yeah,
because it's not zero anymore. And
yeah,
anyone that is like even
yeah,
remotely in the space will and has
yeah,
a credible opinion will tell you it's not zero. And
yeah,
that's kind of what
yeah,
makes it a
yeah,
little crazy. Like, if you're using LLMs to police other LLMs and or train other LLMs, if you're using LLMs for everything, like just this multi-agent system, it can get a little scary, right?
yeah.
If there could be some misinterpretation of
Yeah,
human alignment.
yeah. I mean, I've talked to people from OpenAI and Anthropic around the promise of AGI. Right? Their fervent, almost religious belief that generally intelligent systems are possible, and their conclusion every time I ask them how is this is going to happen is the moment an AI can do data science better than a researcher at OpenAI or Anthropic, we will have AGI because it can then design its own training regimen. It can figure out what data to train on, what ablation studies to run, blah, blah, blah. And so the AI can iterate on its own architecture and improve itself. And that's how we hit AGI. I mean, I fundamentally disagree. I don't think transformers will be AGI. I think it's obvious to anyone who studies them enough,
From
in
a
my
from an
opinion, that
architectural perspective, or
yeah, from architectural perspective, I don't think it's it. I don't think there's like, I don't there's no strong arguments that can be made for or against this claim. But I my intuition from just using them for a long time now tells me that they're not fundamentally capable of doing like extremely long context consistent um, like actions and like doing really long term planning, losing context, so on and so forth. So, anyways, like I don't think there'll be AGI, but this
ever,
question of
or
like
you mean in the
using
near term?
LLMs, I don't. I
You don't
mean,
know.
I think possibly ever. My intuition leans towards never, but yeah, like it's not. It's just a feeling, so it's a vibe.
Yeah, it's a gut vibe.
Yeah.
Uh,
Uh,
How would you? We talked about this earlier, but yeah, how would you distinguish chatbots from agents, and could you kind of describe some of the work that you're doing with Multion?
yes, for sure, for sure. I think the best analogy to think about applications in generative AI is to think in terms of levels of self-driving automation. That's how I think of it, right? You start from level one, human in the loop. AI is basically an assistant. It relies on you to ask it a question to give you a response. And then level two, three, four, five is you don't even need to tell your AI what to do. It just knows what it has to do based on, like, it already knows, like, you're going to ask it for something, and then it goes and does the thing. And then, it's like you wake up in the morning and then there's a coffee on your table, and then the AI is like, I made you some coffee. Like, that's like level five. Like, it's already figured out what you want, already goes and does it. Full autonomous
So isn't
intelligence,
that
like,
okay?
figured it out.
Okay, going back to the last topic, how is that different from AGI?
So AGI is being able to do this in any given domain. Okay, I think we can argue about what's the right definition for AGI, but I think of it as being as statistically efficient as a human in learning. That's what I think of it as, which is if I have someone new come over, maybe there's a carpenter, right? And then I am asking him, hey, can you teach me how to do carpentry? And then he can teach me for a couple of days, and then through a few examples, I'm able to learn how to do carpentry. And but the thing about humans is they can do this in a bunch of domains, like literally any domain you can think of. People can get with it, get moving pretty fast with just like a few demonstrations. So for AI, it's not the case, right? If the data wasn't in the training distribution, it's not clear that it would ever even learn what's something in a completely different, unrelated domain as quickly, if it hasn't even seen any single instance of it in its training before. That's like kind of the question of AGI, which is this. Let's say bot or whoever made me coffee in the morning. If let's say I'm like now an astronaut going to space, and I ask it like, "Hey, can you go fix my spaceship?" Can it go teach itself how to fix that spaceship? Completely new domain, read some books, figure it out, and then go fix a spaceship, which no one's done before. That's kind of how I think of AGI. I think there's other definitions, which is like transformative AGI. This is what I've heard from from Anthropic and OpenAI team, which is the point at which AI generates a substantial percentage of total GDP. They think of that as AGI,
Oh,
like
that's a
transformative
very.
AGI.
I would expect. I wasn't expecting that one. It sounds like that would come out of a economist's mouth or something like that. But
No, I think they've been drilled down pretty hard on their definition. People have been like, really?
economy, right?
Yeah,
It has to do with
yeah, yeah,
TAM. Sounds
yeah,
like a
exactly.
VC economist. That's interesting.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah. So yeah, it's level five AGI, right? Level five is AGI. You're right. I should think of that as AGI, but like you can have extremely autonomous agents within a particular domain. Just because we have so much data in that domain, blah blah blah, that you can have like a fully autonomous DoorDash order. So I think this will get us into multi on like okay. So starting from level one, I think that's where chatbots are, where it's like the human has the cognitive burden of figuring out how to ask the AI what they wanted to get done, make sure that they're saying it in the right way. The AI has to always keep asking for clarification. So it's like an assistant kind of experience. It's human in the loop, human driven, and the AI just kind of in the side, like kind of pushing things along the way. And this is where most people are stuck, largely due to the RAG problem, which is that even to ask an AI your question, if it's for a really large document corpus, you need to do all the stitching work with RAG and stuff to like ask it your question in a way that it understands what you're asking, right? And that's where the ecosystem's stuck. And I think we'll get past that hump eventually, but that's where we are at. Level one, prompting and RAG, just human driven. We ask a question, this thing gets the job done. ChatGPT. That's the only thing that's gotten traction in our space by and large. And at least ChatGPT doesn't make false promises of reliability, right? I think that's why they do so well. Everyone else is trying to build a reliable application on top. It's just the bar is so high, right? It's either you or I use ChatGPT prompt.
That's
So
right.
you as an application who's built on top of ChatGPT better have a higher rate of success than ChatGPT, and like substantially higher. It can't just be a little bit higher; it has to be substantially higher for me to go and buy another subscription for the same model under a different UI. You know what
Yeah.
I mean?
So that
So
brings me to another question that's very popular and on top of people's minds, right? And I know that you guys had gone through the trials and tribulations of wrapper companies that are basically
yes,
kind of a thin layer of automation or technology
yes,
around, say, OpenAI's SDK or Anthropic's or whatever these close.
yeah.
How how would you distinguish them? How would you distinguish them? Who, because there are successful wrapper companies like Perplexity, right? And there's unsuccessful ones, well, or less successful ones. Let's just say, like the Jaspers of the world, right? And
Yeah,
especially like
yeah.
VCs, they really are kind of lost in this area of
Oh yeah.
what company that's in the application layer, right, is the next Perplexity or the next Jasper, right?
Yeah. So I think so yeah, the previous discussion we were having is extremely relevant here, right? It's we okay. Wrapper companies' only moat is their distribution, right? I don't think it's their technology, right? They have to have a really unique marketing voice, a really unique sales messaging, early to market, take over as much of the pie as possible, and then cement your reputation and gain trust. Right? That's the game you have to play if you're a rapper company. You really don't want to be playing the prompt game. Like, dude, prompt engineering, no, just no. That's not a mode. Like, it's the base models will keep changing. The way that RLHF is going to keep changing. So you really don't want to be banking on your prompts as a mode. Um,
So when you
then
mean by prompt
you know
engineering, you mean translating that translation layer between prompts and what you're sending over to the calling the OpenAI's API.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, like that layer, I don't think is a real mode. I think it's just because if you're using a closed source model provider, right, like an API kind of model, OpenAI deprecates models like there's no tomorrow. Like I've seen them deprecate so many models as newer and better ones have come out in 6 months, each one kind of going out of fashion. And then you kind of have to redo your prompt work to a certain extent. As the models are getting better, the amount of prompt engineering you have to do is becoming less relevant. Like one of the most interesting results I saw recently was this lab from University of Virginia did like a review of all the prompt engineering research that's come out over the past year and a half, and then they tried to test some of these. I think of them as like my grandma's advice kind of prompt engineering. Like you should ask it to have a role. You should ask it this way. Like, that's how people prompt engineer these days. And they were just like, okay, let's go through each one of these grandma advice that everyone gives and what actually works. The most surprising thing was role-based prompting doesn't work anymore. Right, that was a thing in the Da Vinci days, GPT-3, like 2022 completion models. Everyone back then used to be like, you are
Oh, that's
blah
right.
blah
Yeah,
blah, and
act
just
as a blah blah.
that doesn't work any. Yeah, it doesn't work anymore. It doesn't work anymore because these models have been RLHF and fine tuned so much since then that has ceased to matter in the increase in performance. Things that do matter are chain of thought, with self
Maybe three-shot
consistency,
learning, you think?
and even,
That's kind of, it's all zero.
yeah, few shots still kind of matters, depending on the domain. But chain of thought gets you the biggest winnings. And another interesting paper I read recently showed that chain of thought, which is extremely long, this is something I do recently a lot in my prompts, is like think through it take a deep breath, think through it step by step, and express your logic in excruciating detail and being as verbose as possible. Because what matters in the prompt is actually how many tokens does the model think for, not as much as a, just having it think through before giving the solution matters, but b, how many tokens it takes to think actually increases your performance. Because I don't know, I think it has to do with the attention matrix, because if the thinking matrix is a bit bigger, it's able to make more connections. That's my intuition. It's not tested, but yeah,
I mean, that
anyway.
definitely makes
So
sense, right? I mean, there's a bigger
yeah,
vector to form similarities off of, or whatever it's doing, right?
yeah, but the point being, like, it is kind of relying on prompt for remote, no go. Things are changing too rapidly. But then the other problem is fine tuning is not in fashion. I think Llama and OpenAI are trying to get it back into fashion for some reason. Because the biggest issue with fine tuning was that if you fine tune a model and then the next generation model comes out, then all the money you put into fine tuning is not as relevant anymore, to kind of redo that work over and over again. Because models are rapidly improving. So you just kind of fine tune. And then some early companies from when we were around back in the day, they tried fine tuning their models, but then GPT-4 came out and then the fine tuning wasn't a mode either. I think the mode right now has to be the UX. What is the experience of interacting with the model? Secondly, the reliability that you can achieve on certain flows, like basically scoping down your AI application as much as possible to something that is actually reliable enough that you go from step one to step two in the autonomy kind of journey. And then basically repurposing your entire product around those flows which AI can do reliably, and then making it more and more like self-serve and making it more like seamless to the point that, and obviously the marketing and sales is still important, but that fundamentally, if you get it right, then you have some kind of a mode which is not just your AI, but it's like your, how does your AI and your software kind of interplay, to make things orders of magnitude easier for someone than doing it via ChatGPT. That's how I think of it right now in my mind whenever I look at
Yeah, I
Apple.
think that's
I'm like,
absolutely right. It's just kind of that user interface, right? I mean, 'cause you're certainly not going
yeah,
to, again, these the area of prompt engineering and so forth, right? In terms of what the
yes,
innovations that these closed source companies are doing, that it just kind of eradicates that. And not only that, it is also changing quite rapidly, right? So that kind of brings me
yeah,
to the next question, which is strategies for scaling LLM evals as the volume and complexity of models increase. I mean, you kind of already touched on it, but then I like to go
yeah,
from there and talk about something that you had mentioned earlier when we were having the AGI discussions about a lot of these companies are using synthetic data to
yeah,
train their
yeah,
models
yeah,
and whatnot, which could lead to some AGI type of function, right? I mean, it could be just as simple as that. I mean,
yeah,
at the end of the day, the header thing that you were describing earlier with the transformers,
yeah,
it's just an ARIMA header, right? I
yeah,
mean, people used to put
yeah,
back in the days where Hugging Face was like where everyone went for the transformers. There was classification headers and whatnot. But the point being, like,
yeah.
yeah, going back to the original questions, like strategies for scaling LLM evals as the volume and complexity of models increase, and yeah, the future of synthetic data driving product growth.
Yeah, no, so I'm really happy you asked me this question, because this is actually what we're focused on right now as a company. We basically decided that, okay, so first, how would you scale your LLM evaluation operations, right? There's two ways. One is you first try to figure out a way to get human out of the loop, right? Which is reduce your reliance on domain experts, try to use their annotations to train your own reward model, and then use that reward model as your signal. This approach, I don't have a lot of confidence in still. Like, there's a lot of our competitors who are doing things like auto feedback, and I think, yeah, a bunch of them are doing the same thing, which is have a human correct like a LLM's reasoning, few shot that into the LLM's prompt, and then have it go rate your logs. I don't still think LLMs are good enough that I think you can realistically take humans out of the loop to a large extent. But then there's the second problem, which I think is much more solvable and tractable and plays to the strengths of the model, which is what examples do you have your annotators annotate? So we think of this as like the interestingness of your log, right? And this is where I think synthetic data gen is important. Okay, I have a system and I need to evaluate how good this is. I cannot, let's say, take human out of the loop on the evaluation front. I still need to rely on an annotator or a contractor for getting that final green check mark. What I do have control over is what I put into the system, right? And what we're working on right now is a simulation framework, synthetic data generation framework, which basically, based on what your application is trying to do, simulates different environments for that application, different kinds of users, different kinds of like plugins, etc. Basically, we have another LLM come in and just spam your system with different ways of a user from India, a user from Russia, a user from America, blah blah blah, like different kinds of users, different personas, different jobs, etc. Spam your chatbot, spam your agent, and then basically we try to rely on deterministic evaluators as much as possible to show you like here are all the interesting ways in which your application has failed, and then essentially go to the annotator with just those extreme scenarios where your system is failing and then have them annotate those things.
I see.
And
So
so,
it's taking
yeah,
a page out of active learning framework, right? And going with
yeah,
the examples with the highest information gain, but using synthetic data, right, to kind of just pump this out.
yep. That's the approach that we're going for now because I don't think you can take human out of the loop. So I think right now, at least in my opinion, though, so if you have the money for it, hire a lot of contractors and get a lot of annotations. If you don't have the money for it, be very judicious in terms of the kinds of scenarios that you're testing your system over to make sure that you're maximizing the amount of information you're gaining from each evaluation that you run. That's the best you can do. People can still rely on LLM as a judge, I think, as like a vague signal. But if you're doing that, make sure you're testing over a lot of examples. What I've seen people do is have like 50, 100 examples in their tests and use LLM as a judge and then make a decision based on that. I'm like, that's not a big enough
Yeah,
sample. That's still like you're still in the stochasticity craziness of the LLM.
but the
You
funny
kind
thing
of
is, like,
haven't.
100 is manageable, right? You know,
Yeah,
for
yeah,
example,
yeah, all
yeah,
of
that's
us.
right.
Yeah,
So it's like you didn't. I remember when fine tuning became like one of the most interesting advances, and all you had needed were like
yeah,
100 examples, like depending on what it was. But yeah, that's manageable. But what you're saying is
yeah,
that's not realistic in this case.
yeah. Like for LLM as a judge, I'm just saying people even try to cheap out over there with like doing the manual grunt work of annotating. They're like, no, I'll just have an LLM judge it. But no,
They
I
have
think
some
it's a good
yeah.
signal. Yeah, so I think synthetic data gen at least applied to the evaluation problem. That's kind of what we're focused on now. But yeah, like synthetic data gen by itself has a lot of uses in training, like Llama models. Or that's just this like one of my favorite memes in this space. It's this Shoggoth meme, right? Which is like there's this monster looking kind of thing, which is
Oh,
GPT
right,
three
right, yeah.
unsupervised, right? And then there's like a smiley face on it, and that was like RLHF GPT. And then there's a like an evolution of the meme. I'll send it to you after, which is now you take the smiley face, that's on the shoggoth, and then you beam out more smiley faces, right? And there's just
There's
beaming smiling faces in all directions. That's synthetic data, and that's GPT-4 and 5 and 6. Like they'll basically come out of like us harnessing this synthetic, like doing synthetic data generation more and more intelligently to steer the models into a more
yeah,
intelligent
because
direction instead
because
of
that
relying
was
on
very
them.
much the concern, I think, around the time where you and I met. It was just like, well, you're
Yeah,
already using all of the internet. How are we supposed to get more some
yeah.
realistic data? But if you think about it from this perspective, um, there could be like an AGI like process fundamentally for using its own data to create more data synthetically, right?
Yeah, it's incredible that it works. Like it worked for Llama, it worked for Grok. Recently released like a tool calling model, which was purely synthetically trained, and it beats Sonnet 3.5 on tool calling. I thought that was incredible
Wow.
result that came out. So yeah, like it's surprising that it works. That the LLM could just spew more stuff and then train on it and then get better. Like,
It is
so yeah,
it's a
you're
little
right.
bizarre. Yeah. As we wrap up here, I do have,
Yeah.
a couple more questions, but one of the bigger questions I wanted to ask you was, what advice would you give companies looking to implement LLM evals processes within their pipeline for the first time? How do you think
Mhm.
about it from the perspective of implementation resources required, like operational costs, budgeting,
Mhm.
etc., for doing this for the first time? What should they be aware of and
Yeah.
whatnot?
This is a really important question. Thanks for asking this. Like, I think a lot of people, whenever they think of doing an LLM project, either internally or user facing, severely discount the importance of evaluation and how expensive and slow it can actually be. So, okay, if it's an internal use case, you aren't super concerned about reliability, but you're still concerned about quality. You kind of want it to be like decently good now and then. Okay, you need to basically thinking in terms of how many users are going to use it and how many times is the LLM going to be run. Based on that, you need to do as accordingly a deep an evaluation. I think this is an obvious statement. This is nothing new, but what I mean by that is if this LLM application is going to be in front of a million people, you just got to make sure that you have run like evaluations that go up to 100,000 like executions or a million executions, depending on how frequently it's being called. And for doing that level of batch analysis, try to invest a lot in like a culture of reading your logs every day and making it easy to just give a lot of ratings very quickly. You could just be bored doing nothing, just rating your logs, so on and so forth. That's I think that's a cultural mindset. It's not like a one and done kind of deal. I feel like people think of evaluation as like a, oh, I just run the eval process, I ship the thing and I'm done. No, models are going to change all the time. API
That's right.
models change all the time.
It's rapidly
Like
evolving.
these things
Yeah.
aren't just, yeah, you can't just think of eval like it's a one and done deal. Like you're not in like front end engineering software era. We are in like the early 70s 80s era of software, like. So in that kind of a world, you really just want to make sure it's a habit. Every single person on your team, doesn't matter, technical, non-technical, constantly keep reading your logs, constantly keep grading them, and then make sure to account for some. You want to essentially get to that golden example set as soon as possible of things where you're really happy with your application's performance and it's very easy to judge its performance, and then hook that up into some kind of automated testing solution as quickly as possible. But yeah, it's a learning process. You have to make sure that the way that you evaluate your system is hooked up to the actual way that it's being used, because of what I said earlier, open-ended usage. You want to make sure you're catering to all kinds of inputs. So yeah, That's what I would say. Like the investment in evals is a lot deeper than you think. It's not only a monetary and a time like investment, it's also a mindset investment, and you need to drive that mindset shift in your team for it to actually work and improve your application. And in terms of like specific pieces of advice around like for different application types, what things to measure, like our blogs should have a lot of that material, so that should cover you for that. But yeah, maybe I can come up with a better answer a bit later. This was just off the
No,
top of my
that's
head,
totally
but
fine. I mean, it's one of the
yeah.
interesting concepts that I read about in the Eval Gen paper was that I've heard of criteria drift,
Yeah, exactly. Criteria drift, of
right?
course. You
But
know about
it's
that. Yes.
it's a constantly evolving thing. It's as you generate more and more evaluations, right? More and more data to evaluate your what you were originally trying to evaluate, the criteria you're trying to evaluate, it evolves, it changes, right? So it's
Yeah.
like chasing a
Yeah.
moving target.
It is actually. I mean, see, that's what happens, right? If you build a system out of a generally intelligent thing, it's kind of to be expected that it would look something like this.
Yeah,
I don't know if
yeah.
that
And
makes
then
like.
as we go through these further and further evals, we're also forgetting the compute cost, right? Then you're paying for
Oh
the
yeah.
inference uh, for the LLM to judge itself, right? It's doubly.
We like. I would just say one thing to people like, please try to find a deterministic, fast, cheap evaluator which gets you a good signal as soon as possible. Don't fuck around with LLM as a judge for too long. Just try to find, it could be simple things like string check,
Fuzzy checks,
number of words
BM25.
checks, fuzzy check. Yeah, try to find a metric like that which you think is actually giving you a good signal, and then hook up your entire system to that deterministic metric and optimize it that way. You will have a much nicer time iterating than if you rely on a very open-ended kind of
But
system,
that
like humans
then
or
we're back
AI.
to, well, shouldn't we be checking for the vibe, right? So it's that is okay. So
Yeah,
it's like this paradoxical
yeah.
thing we're in. The
It requires a lot of critical thinking. I'm
Yeah,
not
that's
gonna lie. Like figuring out the right metric for your system
an
is
application.
that is the
Yeah,
question.
it's a tough one.
Yeah, that's the question.
Last question. We touched on this, uh, using it, Elo scores and Bradley Terry. What's your opinion on using these metrics, right? So I know that it obviously I think it was invented for chess, and all the Bradley Terry is it's the Elo without the log transformation, and we don't have to confine it to just these two, right? But they're popular. I've seen
Yeah,
these are metrics that rank LLMs, and would love to get your opinion on why they make sense and why they're flawed or their biases, whatever.
yeah, yeah. I think Elo is a better system. I think it's the best system we have right now for sure. Just because it's very hard to trust any metric that people come up with for like evaluating such an open-ended system. So I think this kind of like comparative judging system, the way the LMSys team came up with, I do think it's the best system. But um, I think the real solution isn't. I don't think it's still like getting away from the static benchmarks. I think it's we want to basically take the spirit behind MMLU, the way I think of it, and turn it into something that's trustworthy. So I mean, one thing I'm thinking a lot about is synthetic benchmarks, which is like to avoid the data poisoning problem and avoid some of these other issues around why people don't trust current benchmarks. Maybe we should come up with. We really need to innovate in this space. I think the ARC challenge, the ARC benchmark is very interesting in this sense, which is come up with new ways of benchmarking these models' abilities, maybe using hot generated inputs for a particular domain task and then seeing how it performs on average over many repetitions. instead of relying on its one-time score on some question or something like that. Definitely don't trust that method of benchmarking anymore. And yeah, like I also think things around like how much variability in the model's performance gets introduced because of the prompt that you're using on top of it for a particular task. I think there's not nearly enough rigor around that piece, and there is no clear documentation either in a very meaningful sense around. You might use one prompt when you're using the model to answer MMLU. You might use a different prompt when it's doing the ARC challenge. Are you evaluating the same model? Are you? I don't know. Like, you change the
That's
prompt.
right.
So yeah, I think there's a part of it I hoped would be driven by academia, but then all the money and GPUs got sucked dry out of academia and put into industry. So I think and the industry doesn't seem to have a very clear incentive to promoting like unbiased, objective benchmarks. I'm sure OpenAI would love to release a benchmark where they always win, right? But
And
but
I don't know if people would
there's no
trust
one.
anything. But
Yeah, exactly. That's why they don't do it. That's why they don't do it. But OpenAI, Anthropic, and all these labs, they went and hired all the best alignment talent. And so we aren't really left with a lot of people outside those labs to come and help and ideate and build a lot of this stuff. I really like what the stuff Hugging Face does. I think they're giving it a real shot, like coming up with better benchmarking solutions. But yeah, like definitely what we have now is not satisfactory. I think everyone's in consensus.
what would be bizarre is that the government, right, which they have like a huge, they went on a hiring spree for a lot of data scientists within the year or so. If they created something, right, in the name of like algorithmic fairness, right, since we're seeing AI, ML applications and more and more consumer usage, right, driving most of our decisions, like there really isn't that one metric from an agency that everyone can trust to make sure everyone's playing fair. So
Yeah, I think we need a Einstein.
it,
That's my conclusion at
we
this
need another
point
Einstein.
with this space. Yeah, we need an Einstein in this space, like someone to come who actually is a very high IQ to solve some of these problems because they're very tricky. I, safety and bias and unfairness, that's a very hard problem. It's just the definitions, as you said, the metrics are very murky. Um, there's a lot of different ways to spin it, etc., etc. Yeah, yeah, that's that's where I'm
I'm there with you. Who knows how it's
at.
gonna shake out? But hey, Dhruv, honestly, it was this has been one of the one of my funnest talks. So I really do appreciate you kind of
Thank you.
going into the depths of each of these questions and sharing your technical
Yep.
expertise. And yeah, let's to certainly keep in touch. I hope to do a round
Yeah.
two with either you or Malk soon.
Oh yeah.
And yeah, keep producing amazing stuff.
No, I appreciate you for inviting me. I enjoy chatting with you. The questions were great.
Cool. All right. Thank you guys. Bye.